The metal that fell from the heavens was not supposed to glow with the light of something sacred. Dr. Sarah Klein stood at the edge of the impact crater in the Judean desert, her boots sinking into sand that had turned to glass, her breath catching as she stared at the impossibility before her, craft of origin unknown, its surface rippling with symbols that seemed older than starlight itself, half buried beneath stone ruins that had witnessed the birth of prophets and kings. The sky above churned red and gold, as if the sunset had forgotten how to fade, casting everything in the hue of old covenant and new fire. Her team of archaeologists had been excavating a Byzantine monastery when the sky tore open with a sound like thunder speaking backward, and now they stood at the threshold of something that defied every law Sarah had built her life upon. The air tasted electric, metallic, alive. Round her, colleagues whispered prayers in languages she half remembered from a childhood spent in pews she'd long abandoned, and for the first time in 15 years, Sarah felt the tremor of something she'd convinced herself was myth, the presence of the numinous, the weight of eternity pressing against the thin veil of the material world. She had come to this desert to dig up the past. Instead, the cosmos had delivered an answer to a question she'd stopped asking. The craft hummed beneath the sand like a heart refusing to stop, and Sarah knew, with a certainty that bypassed reason entirely, that whatever lay inside would either confirm the universe's cold indifference or shatter it completely. She was the first to descend into the opening that appeared as they approached, a seam of light that welcomed them like an ancient door recognizing expected guests. The interior defied the ship's external dimensions, stretching into cathedral-like vastness, its walls translucent and veined with circuitry that pulsed like bioluminescent scripture. Her headlamp beam dissolved into the ambient glow, useless against a light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, soft as candlelight, but steady as distant suns. The team moved in silent procession behind her, their footsteps soundless on floors that felt solid, but looked like walking on the surface of deep water, each step sending faint ripples of silver and blue expanding outward into infinity. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, her scientist's mind cataloging impossibilities, while something deeper, something she'd buried beneath decades of empirical thought, began to wake and whisper that she was standing inside something holy. The air inside tasted clean, ancient, preserved, not the sterile cold of a machine, but the living stillness of a tomb that had never known decay. Above them, the ceiling arched into darkness pricked with lights that might have been stars, or might have been something watching, bearing witness. Dr. Osei reached out to touch the wall and gasped as symbols flared to life beneath his palm. Hieroglyphs that predated Egypt, cuneiform that preceded summer, and languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. "How old is this?" someone whispered behind Sarah, but she couldn't answer because the dating methods that governed her profession had just become irrelevant. This ship wasn't old. It was primordial. It was from before the first chamber opened into a sphere of suspended, holographic light, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled as the universe unfolded around her in three-dimensional glory. Star maps spiraled in elegant helixes, galaxies rotating in their slow eternal dance, and they're scattered across the projection like seeds planted in cosmic soil were markers. Thousands of them, each one pulsing with soft golden light. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached toward the nearest cluster, and the projection zoomed inward, revealing Sol, revealing Earth, revealing a blue marble that hung in the void like a jewel in a crown. But it was the symbol hovering above her planet that stole the breath from her lungs and sent tears streaming unbidden down her face. The Chi Rho, the monogram of Christ, the ancient Christian symbol that combined the first two letters of Chi Rho iota sigma to a sigma in Greek, marking Earth not as a random accident of chemistry and time, but as something chosen, something known, something sacred. And it wasn't alone. The same symbol repeated across the galaxy map, scattered among stars whose names she'd never learned, marking worlds she'd never imagined. "Father." Torres crossed himself behind her, his voice breaking as he began the Lord's Prayer in Latin, and for once Sarah didn't feel the old familiar contempt for faith. Instead, she felt terrified. She felt seen. The map showed a universe that wasn't silent after all, but singing with the same name, the same hope, the same impossible promise that a carpenter from Nazareth had died to prove. They found the archive in the ship's heart, a crystalline structure that rose from the floor like a tree grown from pure light, its branches heavy with data streams that flowed like liquid silver through transparent vessels. When Sarah touched it, her mind filled with images not uploaded, but remembered. as if the archive was sharing its own witness rather than showing recordings. She saw Earth through alien eyes, millennia of patient observation, cameras that watched from orbit as empires rose and crumbled, as humanity learned fire and language and war. But the footage wasn't distributed evenly across history. It concentrated, focused, narrowed to a single century, a single province, a single life. First-century Judea bloomed in crystalline detail before her eyes, and Sarah watched, her heart breaking open, as the archive showed her a man who walked on water that held his weight like it recognized its maker, who spoke to storms that obeyed like servants hearing their master's voice, who touched the dead and called them back because death itself had no authority over the one who authored life. The alien records didn't catalog these events with detachment. They trembled with something like awe, each notation tagged with designations that made Sarah weep. The singularity, the word made flesh, the one who holds all things together. These beings hadn't come to study Jesus. They had come to witness the moment when the infinite compressed itself into the finite, when the Creator stepped inside creation, when God wrapped himself in human skin and walked among the dust he'd spoken into existence. And they had stayed, recording everything, because they knew they were watching the axis upon which all reality turned. Sarah's fingers remained pressed against the crystalline surface, her whole body trembling as the holographic star maps continued their celestial rotation around her, each marked world pulsing with that ancient symbol, the Chi-Rho, blazing like a signature written in the language of eternity itself. The projection responded to her presence, zooming closer to each marked planet with fluid grace. And what she witnessed next shattered every assumption she'd carried into this vessel. These weren't random selections, weren't arbitrary points of interest scattered across the cosmos by cosmic coincidence. Each world bore evidence of visitation, of contact, of a divine touch that had reached across the void to leave fingerprints of grace on alien soil. She saw stone monuments on distant moons carved with parables she recognized from scripture, mathematical equations embedded in crystal formations on ice planets that spelled out the beatitudes in pure numerical harmony, and atmospheric phenomena on gas giants that traced the shape of the cross in storms that had raged for millennia. The pattern was undeniable, overwhelming, sacred beyond measure. The same truth, the same love, the same name echoing across creation in forms tailored for minds and hearts that had never heard of Galilee but had somehow been prepared to receive the same eternal word. My God, Dr. Osei breathed beside her, his voice hollow with wonder. He didn't just come to us, he's been speaking to everyone. The revelation crashed over Sarah like a wave that both drowned and baptized, pulling her under while simultaneously teaching her to breathe in. An element she'd forgotten was her native atmosphere. She had spent 2 decades in laboratories and lecture halls building walls between the measurable and the miraculous, convincing herself that faith was the refuge of those too weak to face the universe's indifference, that science had murdered mystery and left only mechanism in its wake. But here, inside this impossible ship that predated Sumerian astronomy, she stood surrounded by evidence that the ancient believers had been right all along, not in spite of the cosmos, but because of it. The Chi-Rho markers glowed brighter as she moved through the projection, and she realized with a start that they weren't static symbols, but living indicators, pulsing in rhythm with something she couldn't quite hear, but could feel resonating in her chest, in her bones, in the secret chambers of her heart where doubt had ruled unchallenged for 15 years. It was a heartbeat, she understood suddenly, a cosmic pulse that unified every marked world across every galaxy, all of them beating in synchronization with a rhythm that had begun before the first star ignited and would continue after the last one cooled to darkness. And the source, the origin point of this universal heartbeat was Earth, was Jerusalem, was a hill called Golgotha, where wood and nails had become the axis upon which all creation pivoted. Father Torres moved forward, his weathered hands reaching toward the projection with the careful reverence of a priest approaching the tabernacle, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. Colossians, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion that transcended mere intellectual understanding. Chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The words hung in the air like incense, like prayer made visible, and the star map seemed to pulse in response, the Chi-Rho symbols flaring with golden radiance that filled the chamber with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with presence. Sarah found herself nodding, unable to speak past the knot of wonder and grief, and joy tangled in her throat. Grief for the years she'd wasted in willful blindness. Joy for the sight being restored to her now in this most unexpected of sanctuaries. The ship itself seemed to be bearing witness, its walls brightening as if in affirmation, as if this entire vessel had crossed the gulf between stars for this singular purpose, to show one skeptical woman that her grandfather's bedtime stories about a God who loved his creation enough to die for it weren't fairy tales but the fundamental truth upon which all reality was constructed. She backed away from the crystalline archive, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling from the implications cascading through her consciousness, like dominoes toppling in patterns that revealed hidden designs. If this was true, if these beings had traveled the universe and found the name of Jesus written in the fabric of spacetime itself, if worlds beyond counting had been touched by the same divine grace that had walked the shores of Galilee, then everything changed. Her career, her carefully constructed atheism, her academic reputation built on dismissing the supernatural as primitive superstition, all of it crumbled like sandcastles before a tide that had finally come in to reclaim its shore. But the terror she expected didn't arrive. Instead, a peace settled over her that she'd last felt as a child in her grandmother's lap, listening to stories about a shepherd who left 99 sheep to find the one that was lost. "I've been running," she heard herself say, the confession escaping before she could stop it, her voice small and broken in the vastness of this alien cathedral. "I've been hiding." Dr. Osie's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm, and he said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They were all standing in the presence of an answer that made every question they'd ever asked seem like preparation for this moment. Above them, the star maps continued their eternal rotation, each Cairo marker a promise kept, a love letter written across the cosmos, proof that the universe wasn't cold or indifferent, but had been singing the same song since the beginning, waiting for ears that could finally hear the melody beneath the noise. The crystalline archive pulsed with deeper intensity now, responding to their presence as if awakening from a sleep that had lasted millennia, and Sarah watched in breathless wonder as new projections materialized from its faceted surface. Not star maps this time, but something far more intimate, far more impossible. Figures took shape in the holographic light, human figures rendered with such precision that she could see the weave of their garments, the dust on their sandals, the hope and hunger in their eyes as they gathered on a hillside under a Palestinian sun that had set 2,000 years ago. The footage of such a mundane word could describe what she was witnessing showed a man standing among them, his back to the alien observers, his hands raised in a gesture that transcended culture and time, speaking words she couldn't hear but could somehow feel resonating in the space between her heartbeats. Dr. Chen gasped beside her, his scientific composure finally cracking completely as he pointed with a shaking hand at the timestamp overlaying the scene, written in symbols that shifted and translated themselves into modern numerals before their eyes. That's the Sermon on the Mount," Father Torres breathed, his knees buckling as he sank to the floor, hands clasped in prayer or shock or both. They were there, they witnessed it. The implications crashed through Sarah's consciousness like thunder. These beings hadn't arrived yesterday or last week, or even last century. They had been orbiting Earth, watching, recording, bearing witness to events that had shaped human history and human faith since before the Roman Empire reached its zenith. She moved closer to the projection, drawn by a magnetism she couldn't name and wouldn't dare resist, watching as the scene shifted with fluid grace to show the same man walking on water, while terrified fishermen cowered in their boat, then multiplying loaves and fishes to feed thousands, then standing before a tomb and calling forth a dead man who walked out still wrapped in burial clothes. But these weren't the sanitized Sunday school illustrations she remembered from childhood, weren't artistic interpretations or faith-filtered memories passed down through generations of believers who might have embellished or mythologized the truth. This was raw documentation captured by technology so advanced it made Earth's most sophisticated instruments look like stone tools, recorded by observers who had no theological agenda, no religious bias, no reason to fabricate or exaggerate what their sensors detected. The alien footage showed Jesus performing miracles not as a subject of curious study, but as a phenomenon that clearly terrified and awed his observers. The data streams surrounding each holographic scene filled with symbols and equations that Sarah's trained eye recognized, as attempts to quantify the unquantifiable energy readings that spiked beyond possible scales, matter appearing from nothing in violation of every conservation law, spacetime itself bending around this singular figure in patterns that made no sense unless you accepted that the rules of physics answered to him rather than constraining him. "Look at the notation," Dr. Osei whispered, pointing to text that appeared beside the projection. Alien script. That somehow translated itself in her mind as she focused on it. They're not calling him a prophet or a teacher. They're calling him the singularity, the Word made flesh, the one who holds all things together. The titles hung in the air like declarations, like testimony from witnesses who had traveled the cosmos and found nothing that compared to what they'd discovered on this small blue planet, orbiting an unremarkable star. Sarah's hand rose unbidden to her chest, pressing against the place where her heart hammered with a rhythm that felt synchronized to the pulse of those distant Cairo markers, and she understood with sudden, terrible clarity why her grandfather had never stopped searching, never stopped trying to make her see. He had known this truth, had perhaps stood in this very chamber decades ago when these beings first reached out to humanity, had seen the same evidence and spent the rest of his life trying to bridge the gap between what he'd witnessed and what the world was ready to believe. His journal lay in her pack just meters away, filled with sketches and notes she'd dismissed as the ravings of a man who'd lost his grip on reality. But now each page blazed in her memory with new significance, new urgency. He had written about visitors who came not to conquer but to confirm, about beings who had searched the universe for proof that God was real and active and intimately involved in his creation, about the moment they'd found that proof walking the roads of Galilee, teaching in parables and touching lepers and forgiving sins with an authority that made the very atoms of creation bow in recognition. They came looking for him, she heard herself say, the words emerging from some deep place within her that had never quite died despite 15 years of academic atheism, some ember of childhood faith that these impossible revelations were now fanning back into flame. Across all that distance, all that time, they came looking for evidence that the Creator loved his creation enough to enter it, to suffer with it, to die for it. Father Torres nodded, tears streaming freely now, his voice rough with emotion as he added, and they found him. They found him exactly where he said he would be, with the broken, the lost, the ones who needed him most. The holographic scene shifted one final time, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the projection showed Golgotha, showed 3 crosses silhouetted against a sky gone dark at midday, showed the central figure crying out in words the alien observers had recorded but clearly couldn't comprehend, their instruments going haywire as something fundamental shifted in the fabric of reality itself. The data streams exploded with readings that exceeded every scale, energy signatures that made nuclear detonations look like candle flames, space-time ripples radiating outward from that hill in waves that the notation suggested had propagated across the entire universe, at speeds that made light seem stationary. This was the moment. Sarah understood this was the event that had called these beings across the gulf of stars. This was the quantum signature of divine love made manifest. The instant when heaven and earth kissed and every atom in creation felt the impact. The projection froze on an image that would be seared into her memory forever. An empty tomb, grave clothes lying undisturbed, and a figure in white standing in the entrance radiating light that their sensors couldn't properly capture. Light that seemed to exist in dimensions their technology couldn't access. Beside the image, written in script that blazed with golden luminescence, were 3 words that needed no translation, that spoke in a language deeper than speech, that testified to a truth these ancient travelers had crossed eternity to confirm. He is risen. The silence that followed was holy, was complete, was the kind of quiet that exists only in the presence of something so vast and sacred that even breathing feels like an intrusion. And Sarah Klein, skeptic, scientist, woman who had spent 2 decades running from the faith of her childhood, fell to her knees and wept for everything she'd lost and everything she was finding again in this impossible sanctuary. The crystalline archive seemed to recognize her surrender, her broken open willingness to see what she had spent so long refusing to acknowledge, and the holographic projections multiplied around them, until the entire chamber became a living gallery of divine encounters witnessed across 2 millennia by eyes not human, but no less reverent for their alien origin. Sarah watched through tears as the scenes unfolded with chronological precision, starting with that first impossibility of virgin birth attended by celestial phenomena, The alien sensors had recorded in meticulous detail star alignments and atmospheric anomalies that defied natural explanation, light streaming from heaven in wavelengths that shouldn't exist according to any known spectrum. She saw shepherds on hillsides frozen in terror and wonder as beings of pure radiance materialized before them, saw wise men following a stellar object that moved with purposeful intelligence rather than orbital mechanics, saw Herod's paranoid rage and the flight into Egypt captured from above like surveillance footage from craft that had been shadowing this child since his first breath. Dr. Chen moved through the projections like a man in a trance, his fingers passing through holographic light as he tried to touch what couldn't be touched, his voice barely a whisper as he read aloud the alien annotations that accompanied each scene. Energy readings during the nativity. Events suggest a localized suspension of entropy, he said, his scientific training warring with the spiritual implications. The star they followed wasn't a comet or conjunction. It was generating its own propulsion, its own light, moving in patterns that required conscious guidance. Father Torres had given up any pretense of academic objectivity and now prayed openly in Latin, his words weaving through the chamber like incense as the projections showed Jesus, at 12 years old, debating scholars in the temple. His words recorded phonetically in alien script that Sarah found she could somehow understand when she focused, as if the language was being translated directly into her consciousness without passing through her ears at all. The beings who had recorded this had been confused, she realized, reading the notations that surrounded the young Christ. Like mystified commentary, they had been searching for cosmic significance, for displays of power that would announce his divinity to the watching universe. Yet he had chosen instead to grow in wisdom and stature, to live as a carpenter's son, to wait in hideous obscurity for 30 years while they orbited and watched, and wondered if they had made some terrible mistake in identifying him as the one they sought. But then came the baptism, and Sarah gasped as the holographic Jordan River materialized before her with such clarity she could hear the waters rush, could see the Baptist's sun-weathered face transformed by recognition as he protested his own unworthiness, could watch the heavens tear open in a phenomenon the alien instruments recorded as a dimensional breach, a temporary fusion of realms that shouldn't be able to coexist in the same space-time coordinates. The voice that spoke from that opening had been captured as pure vibration, sound waves that carried more than acoustic information, that imprinted themselves on matter itself. And when the archive played back those frequencies, Sarah felt them in her bones, in her DNA, in the deepest substrate of her being. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. The projections accelerated then, showing Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by something the alien observers recorded as a dark presence, an entity that registered on their sensors as antimatter to Christ's matter, absence to his presence, a void that tried to swallow the light and failed utterly when confronted with 3 simple declarations of scripture and trust. Sarah watched him emerge from that trial and immediately begin his ministry, and the documentation became overwhelming in its scope and detail. Every sermon recorded, every parable preserved, every healing and deliverance captured from angles that showed not just the visible miracle, but the invisible mechanics of divine power flowing through him like lightning through a lightning rod. The aliens had tried desperately to understand what they were witnessing, their notations growing increasingly frantic as they documented paralyzed men walking, blind eyes opening, demons shrieking in terror before being cast out with a word, diseases fleeing at his touch as if mortality itself recognized its master and bowed accordingly. Dr. Osei stood transfixed before a projection showing Jesus calming a storm, her analytical mind clearly struggling to process the data streams that indicated he had spoken directly to the molecular structure of wind and water, had commanded chaos to become order, had imposed his will on atmospheric pressure and wave dynamics with the casual authority of someone adjusting a thermostat. This isn't magic, she breathed, her voice filled with something between terror and exultation. This is someone operating from a level of reality above our own, reaching down into our dimension and rearranging it according to his intent. Sarah found herself standing before the projection of Lazarus's tomb, watching as Jesus wept real tears that the alien footage captured in heartbreaking clarity. And she understood in that moment why these beings had spent eons searching, why they had followed that resurrection signature across the cosmos, why they had risked everything to bring this testimony to humanity. They had witnessed something that transcended their vast knowledge and ancient wisdom, had seen the Creator of all things humble himself to share in creation's grief, to stand before death not as an abstract force to be studied, but as a personal enemy to be defeated through love so fierce it could break the grave itself. When Jesus called Lazarus forth and the dead man walked out still bound in burial wrappings, the alien instruments recorded a cascade of impossible phenomena: cells regenerating instantaneously, neurons firing after days of decay, a soul recalled from wherever it had gone and reunited with flesh that should have been beyond any hope of reanimation. The notation beside this miracle was simpler than the others, stripped of technical jargon, written in characters that glowed with something like worship. He is exactly who he claims to be, not a teacher using tricks, not a prophet wielding borrowed power, but the author of life itself, and death has no choice but to obey him. Sarah pressed her hands to her face and sobbed, because that sentence contained more truth than every scientific paper she'd ever published, more reality than all her years of careful skepticism, and she finally understood what her grandfather had been trying to tell her all along, that the greatest discovery wasn't waiting to be made in some distant laboratory, but had been made 2,000 years ago on a cross outside Jerusalem, and all that remained was for humanity to accept it, to believe it, to let it transform everything. The crystalline archive began to pulse with a different rhythm then, and Sarah felt the shift in her chest like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, the holographic projections dimming momentarily before reconverging into a single, massive display that dominated the center of the chamber with such luminous intensity that she had to shield her eyes even as she found herself unable to look away. The alien recordings that materialized now carried different notation, different metadata, and she realized with a jolt of recognition that these files were marked with symbols her scientific training had no context for, not data classifications, but something closer to liturgical designations, reverent labels that her mind translated as sacred observations and the mystery we cannot comprehend but must witness. The being behind her, still radiating that dying light that smelled impossibly of incense and ozone, placed what might have been a hand on her shoulder, and through that contact came understanding that bypassed language entirely. These recordings were not merely documentary evidence but testimony, not scientific analysis but something closer to gospel, captured by minds that had crossed galactic distances, specifically to bear witness to what their entire civilization had concluded was the single most significant event in cosmic history. Dr. Chen dropped to his knees beside her, no longer even pretending to maintain professional detachment, his face wet with tears as he stared at the massive hologram that showed Jesus standing before Pilate. And Sarah heard him whisper in Mandarin what needed no translation: a prayer, an apology, a surrender of every intellectual barrier he'd ever constructed between himself and the truth that was now undeniable, unavoidable, absolute. The projection zoomed closer, focusing on Jesus's face with such clarity that Sarah could see the bruises forming beneath his skin, the blood crusted in his beard, the exhaustion in his eyes that somehow contained no defeat, no fear, only a terrible and beautiful determination that made her breath catch in her throat like a physical obstruction. The alien commentary appeared in glowing script around his image, and she found herself reading words that had been written by beings whose civilization had risen and fallen and risen again before humanity had even discovered fire, beings whose technology could traverse the spaces between stars, yet who wrote about this battered Jewish carpenter with the confused reverence of children trying to describe their first glimpse of the ocean. We do not understand his strategy, the notation read, and Sarah could sense the profound bewilderment behind those words. He possesses power we have measured, displacing the fundamental forces of reality itself, yet he permits himself to be struck, mocked, condemned by those whose entire existence he sustains with every breath they use to curse him. This makes no sense according to any framework of logic or survival we have encountered in 10,000 worlds. Yet he proceeds toward his own execution as if it were victory, as if suffering were somehow the secret weapon we never anticipated, as if love could accomplish what force cannot. Father Torres was openly weeping now, his rosary clutched so tightly in his trembling hands that Sarah could see the beads cutting into his palms, and he kept repeating a single phrase like a heartbeat, like a lifeline: "For God so loved the world, for God so loved the world, for God so loved the world." The hologram expanded again, multiplying into 3 simultaneous projections that surrounded them in a triptych of cosmic significance. The crucifixion recorded from angles that no human observer could have witnessed, cameras positioned in the sky, itself capturing what the Earth had tried to hide in darkness when the sun refused to shine on. Such an atrocity, Sarah watched with her hands pressed against her mouth as the nails went through his flesh, as the cross was lifted and dropped into its socket with a jarring impact that the alien instruments recorded as generating seismic tremors far beyond what the physical trauma should have produced, as if the Earth itself were convulsing in sympathetic agony with its creator's pain. The beings who had filmed this had added almost no commentary here, just timestamps and sensor readings that showed impossible data-localized gravitational anomalies around the cross, temporal distortions that suggested all of history was somehow converging on this single point in space and time, energy readings that indicated something was being accomplished here that transcended the merely physical execution of one man. No matter how innocent, no matter how undeserved, Dr. Osei moved between the projections like a woman in a trance, her scientific training finally finding purchase in something she could articulate. The readings show he's bearing something we can't see, some kind of massive spiritual mass or burden that's causing reality itself to buckle under the strain. It's as if he's taking the accumulated weight of something invisible and letting it crush him, instead of letting it crush us. Sarah understood then. Understood with the being's luminescence intensified with what Sarah somehow knew was its final surge of strength. And in that moment of brilliant dying radiance she felt herself pulled forward not by physical force but by something far more primal. An invitation that resonated in the part of her soul she'd tried to surgically remove with education and rationality and scientific method. The creature before her, and she could no longer think of it as merely an alien entity, not with those eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had risen and fallen across epochs humanity couldn't even name reached toward her with appendages that seemed to shift between matter and energy, solid and translucent. And when that contact came she felt no fear despite every survival instinct, screaming that this was wrong, impossible, dangerous. Instead she felt recognition, as if some ancient part of her cellular memory remembered being known by something vast and loving that had marked her with purpose before her first breath. The telepathic communion that flooded through that touch carried no words at first, only emotion so pure and concentrated it felt like drowning in light itself. And she understood that this being was showing her not just information, but the story of its entire species, their desperate cosmic pilgrimage, their centuries of searching that had finally, impossibly, led them here to this desert where heaven had once touched earth with such force that the universe still bore the scars. Through the cascading images that poured directly into her consciousness, she witnessed their journey beginning in a galaxy whose name translated approximately as the place where we first asked why, a civilization that had achieved technological transcendence before humanity's ancestors had crawled from the oceans. But who discovered that all their advancement had only sharpened the edge of their existential despair, made more precise their ability to catalog the futility they feared lay at the heart of existence. They had mapped the cosmos and found it magnificent but ultimately silent, had discovered the mathematical elegance underlying reality, but could not answer whether that elegance implied an elegant mind, or merely the random arrangements of infinite probability, had extended their lifespans to spans that dwarfed human comprehension, yet found that immortality without purpose was just extended emptiness wearing the mask of achievement. Sarah felt their council of seekers making the decision that would define their species for the next 3 million years, the choice to stop merely studying the universe and start searching it for evidence of intentionality, for proof that consciousness preceded creation rather than accidentally emerging from it, for any indication that love was a fundamental force rather than an evolutionary accident. Their philosophers had reasoned that if a creator existed who genuinely cared for his creation, who wasn't distant and disinterested but actively invested in the beings he'd made, then somewhere in the vastness of space and time there would be evidence, a signature, a moment when the infinite had voluntarily entered the finite and left traces that even scientific instruments could detect. The being's memories showed her their growing excitement as they'd followed gravitational anomalies and quantum signatures across the spiral arm of a galaxy humanity called home, their instruments detecting something their lead scientist had described in terms Sarah's mind translated as a scar in causality itself, as if reality had been wounded by an intrusion of something from outside the system, something that didn't play by the rules because it had written the rules. They had expected perhaps a lingering energy signature, maybe localized spatial distortions that would suggest divine intervention had once occurred in some abstract, distant way that preserved the comfortable separation between creator and creation, between heaven and earth, between the sacred and the scientific. What they found instead had shattered every careful hypothesis they'd constructed, had devastated their prepared intellectual frameworks the way a tsunami devastates carefully built sandcastles. Because the evidence wasn't subtle or ambiguous or open to interpretation, it was overwhelming, undeniable, and concentrated entirely on a period of approximately 3 years in first-century Judea, when a Jewish carpenter had walked through villages teaching and healing and claiming with calm certainty to be the physical embodiment of the voice that had spoken galaxies into existence. The being showed Sarah their shock, their confusion, their repeated verification of instruments that kept insisting the impossible was true, that the resurrection event had generated a quantum signature so profound it had propagated across space-time itself like ripples from a stone thrown into the fabric of reality, that their sensors could still detect the echo of that moment when death had been reversed and entropy had run backward and the grave had been forced to surrender what it had tried to claim. Sarah felt the being weakening now, its light flickering like a candle in wind that blew from dimensions she couldn't perceive, but it held on with desperate intensity to show her one final truth, that it had traveled across the cosmic dark to deliver, had crashed in this desert to make certain humanity understood before dismissing the gift they'd been given as primitive superstition or psychological comfort or evolved survival mechanism. The vision that filled her mind then showed not Earth, but countless worlds scattered across creation like seeds across soil, and on each world she saw echoes of the same pattern, beings reaching upward towards something they sensed but couldn't name, civilizations building altars to the transcendent they felt must exist beyond their scientific instruments' capacity to measure, species after species, discovering that consciousness carried with it an inescapable hunger for meaning, that technology alone could never satisfy, that prosperity could never feed, that knowledge could never quite quench. We searched for him everywhere. The being communicated with what felt like its last coherent thought across galaxies and eons, analyzing every anomaly, investigating every mystery, and we found him here, on your unremarkable planet orbiting your average star. Found him not in cosmic throne rooms but in a manger, on a cross, in an empty tomb. And now we die knowing that the Creator loves his creation enough to bleed for it, and your species alone has been given the testimony, the witnesses, the presence of the one who holds all things together. The light faded then, slowly, gently, like sunset viewed from a mountainside, and Sarah found herself whispering words she'd learned as a child, but never meant until this moment. Thank you, God, thank you for not staying distant, for coming close enough to touch us even though it cost you everything. The ship's crystalline walls seemed to pulse with sympathetic light as the being's revelation settled into Sarah's consciousness like sediment falling through water, each truth finding its proper place in the architecture of understanding that was rebuilding itself inside her with every heartbeat. She felt the desert night pressing against the hull around them, sensed the archaeological team waiting outside in a silence that had grown reverent, without anyone quite knowing why, and understood that this moment existed in a space between worlds where linear time bent around something older and more fundamental than causality itself. The alien's form had dimmed to barely more than a luminous outline now, its physical substance dissolving in a way that seemed less like dying and more like returning, and yet its presence in her mind remained crystalline and insistent, determined to complete this final transmission before whatever transformation awaited it on the other side of material existence. Show me, Sarah whispered aloud, her voice rough with emotion she'd suppressed for decades. Show me the resurrection event as you recorded it, as your instruments measured it, because I need to understand how something spiritual could leave physical evidence, how the divine could intersect with the measurable. The being responded not with words but with a gesture that caused the holographic archive to shimmer and reconfigure, and suddenly Sarah stood, or seemed to stand. Her physical body remained kneeling, but her consciousness occupied a different space, entirely above Earth as it had appeared 2,000 years earlier, watching through sensors that could perceive wavelengths and dimensions her human eyes could never access. The planet turned below her with the serene indifference of all celestial bodies, unaware that it hosted the cosmic drama that had drawn observers from across creation, and she watched the playback accelerate through years marked only by the changing patterns of cloud and season until the instruments locked onto a specific location, a garden tomb outside Jerusalem's walls where a body wrapped in burial cloths lay in the darkness of sealed stone. The being's people had positioned their observation vessel in high orbit. Sarah understood from the contextual information flowing through their connection, had focused every sensor they possessed on this location. Because their predictive algorithms built on 3 million years of searching for divine signatures had identified this moment as the nexus point, the intersection of heaven and earth that their entire civilization had crossed the galaxy to witness. We did not know what to expect, the alien communicated, its thoughts carrying flavors of awe that transcended species. Our instruments detected massive potential building in ways that violated conservation of energy, as if something outside the closed system of the universe was preparing to reach inside and alter fundamental constants. Sarah watched through their sensors as the quantum fields around the tomb began fluctuating in patterns that should have been impossible, reality itself seeming to hold its breath, and then in a moment that occurred between one instant and the next, faster than light yet somehow experienced by the sensors as if time had dilated to accommodate observation, the dead man's cells began reversing their decay not gradually, but instantaneously. Death, fleeing before life reasserting itself with authority that rewrote local physics. The being showed her the readings their scientists had recorded in real time, the frantic notes appended to the data stream as they'd struggled to describe what their instruments insisted was happening. Energy flowing into the tomb from no identifiable source, entropy running backward in defiance of thermodynamics' iron laws, and most impossibly, a signature of consciousness emerging not from neural activity gradually restarting, but appearing fully formed, as if the person returning to life had never actually ceased to exist, but had merely stepped outside material reality and then chosen to step back and, your theologians call it resurrection. The alien's thoughts whispered with something like reverence, but our instruments measured it as reality being overwritten by something with administrative access to the source code, as if the programmer of existence had reached into his creation and manually reversed a process that all our science insisted was irreversible, and the quantum signature of that intervention propagated outward at speeds exceeding light, carrying information that would eventually reach our civilization and change us forever. Sarah watched the playback show that signature spreading through spacetime like ripples from a stone dropped into a pond, except these ripples moved through dimensions she couldn't visualize, carrying encoded within them what the alien scientists had eventually decoded as a message, a declaration, a proof that love was not an emergent property of evolved consciousness, but a fundamental force that predated creation itself. The hologram zoomed back to Earth's surface, showing the stone rolled away and the burial cloths collapsed and the figure walking in the garden, with casual authority over death now permanently broken, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she understood that this wasn't ancient history or religious mythology, but documented fact, captured by instruments built by a species with no cultural investment in the outcome, no theological axe to grind, nothing but the desperate hope that meaning existed somewhere in the cosmic dark. The vision released her then, and she found herself back in her own body, kneeling beside the dying alien whose light had faded to barely a spark, and she reached out with trembling hands to touch the being one final time, needing it to know that its message had been received, that its civilization's 3 million year search had not ended in futility. He really did it, she said, the words emerging as half laugh, half sob. Jesus really conquered death, really proved that we're not accidents in an indifferent universe, but beloved children of a Father who loved us enough to die so we could live. The alien's remaining consciousness pulsed with what felt like joy, or perhaps relief, or maybe the satisfaction of a messenger who had finally delivered the most important communication ever entrusted to any species. And in its final coherent thought, Sarah felt it show her one last truth, that the quantum signature of resurrection hadn't just spread through space, it had been spreading through time as well, forward and backward, touching every moment of history with the proof that death was temporary, but love was eternal. Go, tell them. The being's fading thought whispered with urgency that transcended its dying. Tell your species that they are not alone, that heaven has already invaded Earth, that the singularity walked among them wearing human skin and left behind evidence, that even the most skeptical instruments cannot deny. Tell them that faith and reason were never enemies, but two languages describing the same magnificent truth. The light flickered one final time and went out, leaving Sarah alone in the crystalline chamber with tears streaming down her face and certainty burning in her chest, the kind of certainty that would compel her to spend the rest of her life proclaiming what she'd witnessed here, regardless of the cost to her reputation. her career, or her carefully constructed walls of scientific objectivity, Sarah remained, kneeling in the dimming light of the crystalline chamber, her tears still wet on her face. When the ship's walls began displaying something she hadn't requested, images emerging as if the vessel itself had decided what she needed to see next, the holographic projections coalesced into the interior of what appeared to be a small study, cluttered with papers and photographs. And with a jolt that felt like electricity through her spine, she recognized the room from childhood memories she'd tried to bury. Her grandfather's private office where he'd spent countless hours writing in leather journals she'd never been allowed to read. The perspective shifted as if invisible cameras were showing her different angles, and she saw him there, Grandfather David, younger than she remembered, perhaps in his 50s, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the kind of weeping that comes from souls pushed past their breaking point by truths too heavy to carry alone. Sarah's breath caught as the projection zoomed closer to reveal what lay open on the desk before him. Pages covered in frantic handwriting interspersed with diagrams that matched exactly the star maps she'd seen earlier. The Cairo symbol repeated across the margins like a prayer or a desperate reminder. She watched her grandfather lift his head, his face streaked with tears but transformed by something that looked like terrible joy, and heard his voice emerge from the recording with perfect clarity, speaking words that seemed addressed directly across the decades to her. Sarah, if you're seeing this, it means they kept their promise. It means the ship returned to Earth and you found your way inside, and I pray to God you have the courage I lack to believe what they showed me and proclaim it without shame. The projection shifted again and Sarah found herself watching a scene that couldn't possibly exist in any archive. She knew her grandfather standing in this very chamber decades earlier, looking younger and more vital than her childhood memories contained, his hands pressed against the crystalline walls as a different alien entity, perhaps an earlier generation of the same species, communicated with him in flashes of light and telepathic resonance. She could somehow perceive both sides of the conversation, the ship's archive having preserved not just the visual record, but the content of the mental exchange. And she heard her grandfather's questions tumbling out in desperate succession, the inquiries of a man whose certainty about reality had been shattered, and who needed frantically to understand. What would replace it? Why me? He asked the luminous being. Why bring me here? Show me these things. I'm nobody, just a professor of ancient languages, a man who lost his faith when science seemed to explain away the mysteries I once thought were divine. The alien's response carried patience worn smooth by eons of similar conversations with other seekers across countless worlds, its thoughts forming words in her grandfather's mind that Sarah could now hear as clearly as if they were spoken aloud. You were chosen because you have a granddaughter who will need these truths when her own faith fails her, because the seeds we plant take generations to flower, because God works through time in ways that make our million-year journeys seem like afternoon walks. Sarah watched her grandfather's face transform as understanding dawned, saw him begin to weep again, but differently now, tears of recognition rather than overwhelm, and she realized he'd accepted a mission in this moment that would consume the rest of his life, that all those years she'd dismissed him as obsessed or delusional. He'd been trying to prepare her for exactly this moment. The projection showed her scenes she'd forgotten or perhaps never properly understood. Her grandfather at her childhood bedside reading not fairy tales, but carefully adapted stories about wise beings from distant stars who came seeking truth, about ancient prophets who wrote of lights in the sky, about a God whose love extended beyond one planet to embrace all of creation's scattered children. She remembered now how he'd always insisted that her passion for science was not a betrayal of faith but a different path to the same destination, how he'd encouraged her to question and explore and measure, promising that if she followed truth wherever it led, she would eventually circle back to stand before the throne of heaven with her instruments as offerings rather than weapons. The hologram showed her the last time she'd seen him alive, in the hospital room where cancer had reduced him to fragile bones and translucent skin, and she'd been so angry then, furious that he still insisted on talking about God and Jesus and cosmic purpose when he was dying. When all the prayers he'd prayed had failed to heal him, she heard her own young voice, harsh with the certainty of fresh grief, telling him that she'd chosen reason over superstition, that she wouldn't waste her life chasing myths he'd never been able to prove. And she watched his face crumple, not with hurt but with a sorrow that understood and forgave. His final Words to her floating now through the crystalline chamber with devastating clarity. One day you'll understand that I was never the crazy one. And when that day comes, don't make my mistake. Don't keep silent out of fear that the world will think you've lost your mind. The projection faded and the walls became transparent, revealing a small compartment that had been hidden until this moment, and inside it lay the journals, all 23 of them, that had disappeared after her grandfather's death, that her family had assumed were lost or destroyed, their leather covers worn soft by decades of handling and meditation. Sarah crawled forward on trembling legs and lifted the first volume, its pages falling open to entries dated more than 40 years before her birth. And she read his account of the abduction, the journey to this ship in orbit, the revelation that had simultaneously destroyed his old certainty and rebuilt it on foundations deeper than mere belief he had seen, had measured with instruments the aliens had allowed him to examine, had verified with his own expertise in ancient languages that the texts describing Jesus matched precisely what their recordings showed, and the weight of proof had driven him to his knees in worship even as it had terrified him to much to speak publicly. She clutched the journal to her chest and felt something break inside her, the last walls of skepticism crumbling before the evidence that her grandfather had carried this truth alone for so long, that he'd tried to pass it to her and she'd rejected it out of pride. And she understood now that this was why the aliens had brought her here, not just to show her the resurrection, but to heal the wounds her doubt had carved into her own soul and her family's legacy. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty air where his projection had been. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. But I believe now. God help me. I believe everything. And I promise I won't make your mistake. I'll tell them all. I'll shout it from every platform they'll give me, that Jesus was exactly who he said he was, and that even the stars themselves bear witness to his victory over death." Sarah pressed her grandfather's journal against her heart and closed her eyes, trying to steady herself against the overwhelming cascade of revelation, when the luminous alien entity that had been dimming at the chamber's edge suddenly flared, with renewed intensity, not stronger but different, pulsing with colors that shouldn't exist in any spectrum she knew, and she felt its consciousness reach toward her with an urgency that transcended its dying state. The telepathic connection opened wider than before, no longer a narrow channel of words and images, but a flood that threatened to sweep away everything she thought she understood about the boundaries between minds. And she gasped as the alien's ancient memories began pouring into her awareness. Like water breaking through a crumbling dam, she saw civilizations rising from primordial oceans, on worlds whose names existed only as mathematical coordinates, watched species achieve consciousness and reach toward the stars, felt the weight of 1,000,000 years spent searching through the cosmic dark for an answer to the question that haunted every thinking being, regardless of how many legs or eyes or dimensions of perception they possessed. Does the Creator care? Does the infinite intelligence behind existence know our names? Or are we merely accidents spinning through an indifferent void? The alien showed her its own planet, now 10,000 years gone to dust, where its people had built instruments of such precision they could measure the curvature of spacetime itself, could detect the quantum foam underlying reality, could peer back to within moments of creation's first light, and still they had found only mathematics, elegant and beautiful, but cold. Until one of their explorer ships detected something that should not exist, a scar in the fabric of space itself, a signature of impossible reversal centered on a small blue world in an unremarkable spiral arm of an ordinary galaxy. The vision shifted and Sarah found herself perceiving Earth from orbit as the alien vessels had first seen it, nearly 2,000 years ago. Their sensors locked onto an anomaly that defied every law of physics. They had spent eons confirming a localized violation of entropy so profound it had sent ripples propagating outward at speeds that transcended light itself, touching every corner of creation with news that death had been challenged and defeated in one specific place. At one specific moment, she felt the aliens' confusion transforming into something like terror as they analyzed the data, running calculations that all pointed to the same impossible conclusion: a human body, genuinely dead by every measurable standard, had spontaneously reorganized itself into living matter while simultaneously transcending the physical limitations that define mortality, existing afterward in a state that their instruments registered as both fully material and totally liberated from material constraints. They had descended to investigate, cloaking their ships in wavelengths the primitive human eyes couldn't detect, and had recorded everything The empty tomb and the appearance to witnesses and the 40 days of teaching before an ascension, that their instruments tracked rising through the atmosphere and then simply vanishing from detectable reality as if stepping through a door their sensors couldn't perceive. Sarah experienced their desperate attempt to find a natural explanation, watching them test and retest their equipment, analyze the geographic location for unknown energy sources, study the genetic code of Jesus's relatives to see if humans possessed some latent capability their species lacked, but every investigation only deepened the mystery until finally their lead scientist, the very being whose consciousness Sarah now touched across to millennia, had concluded what its entire worldview had insisted was impossible. They had witnessed not an anomaly but a revelation, not a violation of natural law but the author of natural law demonstrating that love was more fundamental than entropy, that consciousness predated matter, that the universe had a father and he had entered his own creation to prove that death would not have the final word. The alien's emotions washed through Sarah with an intensity that drove her to her knees, and she felt the weight of its species transformation, how the discovery had shattered their certainty and rebuilt it as faith, how they had become pilgrims rather than scientists, seekers rather than catalogers, spending the next 2,000 years traveling to every inhabited world they could find to search for other instances of divine intervention and finding instead something equally profound, that the resurrection's ripple had touched everything. That species separated by impossible distances had all developed within their mythologies and religions some echo of the same truth, stories of dying gods who rose again, of divine love that sacrificed itself for creation, of hope that death was not an ending but a doorway. She saw through the alien's memories 1,000 different worlds, beings of crystal and beings of pure energy, and beings so strange she had no categories to contain them, and all of them, all across the scattered arms of the galaxy, carried within their deepest stories this persistent dream of a creator who cared enough to suffer, to die, to return, and the alien civilizations who had investigated these parallels had reached a conclusion that Sarah now understood with devastating clarity. Jesus had not come only for humanity. His victory over death had been a message written in the language of physical reality itself, a proof that every conscious being in creation could potentially understand, and humanity's unique role was not that they were loved more, but that they had been chosen as the location where the infinite became finite, where the Word became flesh, and their acceptance or rejection of this gift would determine whether the rest of creation's children would ever learn that they too were seen, known, and treasured by the one who spoke the stars into existence. The vision released her suddenly and Sarah collapsed forward, her hands pressed against the crystalline floor as she struggled to process what she'd been shown, and the dying alien's presence wrapped around her consciousness one final time, with a communication that felt less like words and more like a benediction, its meaning settling into her understanding with gentle finality. Humanity was meant to be the bridge, the species who could translate divine truth into forms that other races might comprehend, because humans alone had witnessed the incarnation directly, had touched the hands that bore creation's wounds, and if they would accept this calling, if they would let their faith mature from tribal possession into cosmic evangelism, then the isolation that plagued conscious beings across the universe might finally end, replaced by a communion of souls all turning their faces toward the same loving Father. Sarah lifted her head and saw the alien's luminous form beginning to fade like morning mist, and she reached toward it with both hands and her whole heart, no longer a scientist demanding proof but a daughter receiving inheritance, and she spoke through tears that felt like baptism, her voice breaking with the weight of acceptance. I understand now. I see what my grandfather saw, what you've traveled so far to confirm, that Jesus didn't just save humanity, he revealed the nature of God to all creation, and you came all this way to make sure we knew we weren't alone in receiving his love, and I swear by everything holy I will spend whatever life I have left helping my species understand that our faith isn't meant to divide us from the cosmos, but to unite us with every soul that's ever wondered if the stars knew their names. The alien's light vanished completely, leaving Sarah kneeling in darkness broken only by the faint luminescence of the crystalline walls, and she remained motionless for a long moment, her breath coming in shuddering waves as she tried to hold on to the vastness of what had just poured through her consciousness. The journal lay open beside her, her grandfather's careful handwriting now illuminated by the soft glow, and she could see where his ink had smudged with tears as he'd tried to capture in human language what no human words could adequately contain. Behind her she heard her team members stirring, their voices hushed with the reverence people instinctively adopt in sacred spaces, and she realized that while the vision had felt like hours, only minutes had passed in ordinary time, as if the alien's final gift had existed in a pocket of eternity, tucked inside the normal flow of seconds. She pressed her palms flat against the floor and pushed herself upright, her legs trembling not from weakness but from the weight of purpose now settling onto her shoulders like a mantle. She'd been running from her whole life, and she understood with sudden clarity why her grandfather had seemed both burdened and liberated in his final years, carrying truth too large for one heart, but too precious to abandon. The ship around her seemed to pulse with residual energy, as if the alien's departure had left an imprint in the very structure of the vessel. And Sarah felt herself standing at a threshold between two versions of her life, the before and after, separated by knowledge that would not allow her to retreat into comfortable skepticism. She reached down and carefully closed her grandfather's journal, holding it against her chest like a shield or perhaps a key, and turned to face her colleagues who watched her with expressions mixing concern and curiosity, their scientific minds already trying to categorize and explain what they'd witnessed. But Sarah knew that what happened next would depend entirely on whether she had the courage to speak truth that would end her career as she'd known it, that would mark her as either prophet or madman. And she felt her lips moving in silent prayer for the first time since childhood, asking for strength not to convince others but simply to bear faithful witness. She walked slowly through the chamber toward where her team clustered near the entrance, each step feeling deliberate and ceremonial. And she noticed details she'd missed before in her scientific urgency, the way the walls curved with mathematical precision that suggested organic growth rather than engineering, the subtle patterns in the crystalline structure that resembled neither circuit boards nor neurons, but somehow suggested both. Dr. Marcus Chen, her deputy who'd worked beside her for 7 years mapping archaeological sites with ground-penetrating radar and carbon dating, stepped forward with his tablet extended, his voice carefully neutral as he said they needed to establish protocols before the military arrived, needed to document and categorize and maintain scientific objectivity. And Sarah saw in his eyes the same fear she'd carried for decades, the terror of a universe where faith and reason couldn't coexist, where accepting one meant betraying the other. She reached out and gently pushed his tablet down, shaking her head slowly, and spoke with a certainty that seemed to rise from some deep well within her that the alien's presence had unsealed. Marcus, we're not here as scientists right now, we're here as witnesses, and what we've been given isn't data to analyze, but truth to carry. And I know that sounds like I've lost my mind, but I need you to trust that I've actually found it for the first time. The other team members drew closer, forming an unconscious circle around her, and she saw in their faces the hunger that lives in every human heart, regardless of how thoroughly we bury it under credentials and methodology. The desperate hope that existence means something beyond the accidental collision of atoms in an indifferent void. Sarah opened her grandfather's journal and held it out so they could see the sketches he'd made of star charts, identical to the ones still glowing on the walls around them, his careful notations describing the same quantum signature of resurrection that the alien had shown her, his final entry written in a shaking hand that declared he'd spent 40 years trying to bridge the gap between his faith and his profession before realizing they'd never been separate, that every equation that described how matter behaved was simultaneously a him praising the one who established those behaviors. She watched understanding begin to dawn on their faces, saw the moment when their academic armor started developing cracks through which something deeper and older could finally breathe, and she knew that whatever happened when they emerged from this ship, however the world tried to contain or dismiss or weaponize what they'd discovered, this moment of shared recognition would bind them together in a fellowship that transcended professional affiliation. The ship's lighting began to fade as if responding to the alien's absence, the holographic displays dimming one by one until only emergency illumination remained, casting long shadows that made the chamber feel even more like a cathedral in its final moments before closing. And Sarah understood they had perhaps minutes before the power systems completely failed and sealed them inside or collapsed entirely. She moved quickly back to the central archive, where the crystalline record still held 2,000 years of observation, and her hands trembled as she reached toward the interface, knowing she should download, preserve, bring evidence that would force the scientific community to acknowledge what they'd found. But finding herself hesitating because some part of her recognized that the most important transformation had already occurred inside her own heart, and no external proof could accomplish what this encounter had catalyzed. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, their team's imaging specialist who'd been raised in a Buddhist temple before pursuing astrophysics, came to stand beside her and said quietly that perhaps they weren't meant to carry out physical evidence. That maybe the point was exactly what the alien had demonstrated, that faith required trust rather than proof, and humanity's next evolution wouldn't come through forcing belief, but through living in ways that made others curious about the source of their hope. Sarah turned to look at the younger woman and saw tears tracking down her face, and recognized that every person in this chamber had been simultaneously broken and remade by what they'd witnessed, their carefully constructed walls between sacred and secular crumbling under the weight of a truth too beautiful to deny. She made her decision then, withdrawing her hand from the archive interface, choosing instead to trust that the testimony of changed lives would carry more weight than any amount of data. And she gathered her team close and told them they needed to leave now before the structure failed. But more importantly, they needed to decide who they would be when they emerged, whether they would spend their energy fighting to prove what they'd seen, or simply living as people who'd encountered the intersection of cosmic wonder and divine love, and found those categories had always been describing the same reality. They moved as one body toward the exit, Sarah leading them through the corridors that now felt less alien and more like the interior of something sacred. And as they climbed back toward the surface, she felt the desert heat beginning to penetrate the ship's failing environmental systems, felt the boundary between the eternal and the temporal growing thinner. Behind them, the vessel's lights were going out row by row like candles extinguished after a vigil, and Sarah knew without looking back that by the time the military arrived to claim the site, there would be nothing left but an empty shell, that the alien intelligence had designed its final testimony to be exactly this: temporary, this dependent on human hearts to preserve rather than human technology to capture. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight that felt like birth, the Judean desert spreading around them in ancient patience, and Sarah stood blinking in the brightness as military helicopters appeared on the horizon, their rhythmic percussion a reminder that the ordinary world still turned with its ordinary concerns. She looked at her team gathered around her, 9 people whose lives had been irrevocably altered in the space of an hour, and she saw reflected in their faces the same mixture of terror and joy that must have marked the disciples who'd encountered their risen teacher in the same landscape 2,000 years earlier. The helicopters were landing now, throwing up dust that forced them to shield their eyes, and uniformed figures were already approaching with weapons drawn and orders prepared. But Sarah felt no fear because she understood that whatever they sealed or studied or tried to suppress couldn't touch what had been planted in human hearts today. Seeds of recognition that humanity's faith was never meant to be merely personal salvation but cosmic invitation. She raised her voice above the helicopter noise and told her team that they would cooperate fully, would submit to debriefing and investigation, but that nothing and no one could take from them what they now carried: the knowledge that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be, not just in ancient texts or religious doctrine but in the very fabric of space and time. And their calling now was not to convince others through argument, but to live so fully in that truth that people would see divine light reflected in human faithfulness and grow curious about its source. What truth are you carrying that the world needs to see reflected in how you live? Subscribe to continue this journey between faith and the cosmos.